And now we're going to get to our main topic today. We are going to get back to the Dungeon Master's Guide, Chapter 5. This will be our third dive into Chapter 5. We looked in Part 1 and Part 2 at dungeon settings and dungeon encounters, and wilderness settings and wilderness encounters. Now we're getting into the urban settings, as well as unusual environments and traps.
It's amazing,
So
Shawn,
last
how
week,
much work
yeah,
this chapter is doing, right? It's like, wow, kind of
yeah,
mind blowing.
yeah, how much work it's attempting to do and how
Mm-hmm.
much work it's not actually doing,
Mm-hmm.
which is a paradox, but not not surprising
Yeah.
with the beast that role-playing games are. So we've talked about what the Dungeon Master's Guide says about designing games and mapping dungeons, designing and mapping dungeons, what they've said about designing and mapping wildernesses. We touched momentarily on mapping settlements, which was little more than some tables for randomly creating race relations, ruler status, notable traits, what a settlement is known for, the current calamity in a settlement, and then 7 tables to create random buildings within your randomly created settlement. But now we're going to get into the actual uh urban encounters, right? Urban dungeon crawling, if you will. And my first thought on reading all of this is there's the old saying that form follows function, right? You figure out what something is going to do and then you design it to do that thing. And I'm beginning to feel like in role-playing games, form uh doesn't follow function and function seems to follow form. So what we do is we create the building and then we decide what we're going to do within the building, as opposed to deciding what we want the building to do and then designing to serve that function.
That's a great point, Shawn.
And
I agree with
yeah,
you fully. Like this whole section is almost it's like it's a really weird slice at a toolkit, but not really a toolkit that creates a place and almost doesn't talk at all about what the adventure there is, which is fascinating to me. And I would say, like, I hate to say the word wrong, but it's kind of wrong. Like, I don't think it's the right path for people to follow.
yeah, it's the same thing we've sort of been talking about throughout a lot of the Dungeon Master's Guide here, which is that it seems like it's built for people who already know how to dungeon master. It feels like it's for people, it's more of writing prompts than teaching how to write, right? It assumes that you are going to know what to do with these tools, and the tools might be cool and the tools might be fun, but unless you know how to use those tools, it's a bit lacking in its utility.
Yeah, and some of our
And so
listeners,
hopefully when we see, yeah,
have raised the question, well, is this being written for experts? And sort of the starter set does the intro work, but the starter set isn't really teaching you how to DM. So something has to, some product should, and there's nothing in between. So this is the product that would, right?
mhm,
And it is the Dungeon Master's Guide, but it doesn't really guide you in that way. And it's fascinating.
right. Even something as simple as think ahead about what you want to take place in this town and make sure that a building is there. If if there are rituals going on in the town that the characters need to stop, there should be a magic guild or an alchemist or somebody who they can go to be able to learn how to stop the ritual if they don't know automatically.
Mm.
Uh, right. If there is this ritual in town, you will need secret societies of evil god worshiping people. So you need to have sewers where they can meet or secret build, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even take that first step in helping out game masters.
And even a to answer the questions to me would be the top question of how do I make a good urban adventure? What are the keys to that?
Right.
And if I look at the chapter headings, I go, no. So,
Right.
uh,
Yeah. And right. So the first thing that this should talk about, and we'll get to this in a second, is what makes urban encounters and urban adventures different from dungeon or wilderness encounters or adventures.
mhm,
What goes on in these urban areas that will make your adventure different? And it doesn't discuss that. It doesn't say in dungeons and in wildernesses, you don't have the safety that you would have um in in a
in
town where
urban,
you
yeah,
can go to a place with a warm fire, where you can go to a place, even if you have to steal it, that has food, that has air that you
mhm,
can breathe, that has, right, those sorts of things.
yeah,
You're also closer to civilization, and there are more innocent people around. There are more people that you have to consider and worry about. You can't just throw fireballs willy-nilly. If you come across people in a dungeon or out in the middle of nowhere, yes, they may be innocent, but they're people that you have to think about and deal with in this strange situation. Whereas in an
yeah,
urban environment, they're just people walking up and down the street, and how that affects an adventure.
yeah. And um, this starts with the section law and order, which I think is very interesting, and in fact is preceded by a statement that says, "quote Characters who don't go looking for trouble can take advantage of all the benefits that a settlement has to offer." But then it doesn't tell me what those benefits are, and or
Mhm.
whether the idea is that characters behave, because then it tells me law and order, trials and sentences, and we are kind of told that if they're based on the settlement size and the alignment of the settlement, which is very interesting, uh, this will shape how much of a trial you get and how you might be sentenced. And I like this quote: "A person found guilty of a crime is usually fined, condemned to forced labor for a period of several months or years, exiled, or executed, depending on the magnitude of the crime." And I'm thinking, great. What does the DM do with this, Sean?
It begs the question, what is the role of adventurers in a world?
Yeah.
Are they supposed to be are they supposed to be treated in the same way as every other citizen, or are they the exceptions to the rule? And if they are the exceptions to the rule, if and you could run a campaign either way, but you need to make that decision at some point, then this law and order section comes into play, right?
Right.
Are the characters going to be able to break the laws with impunity and get away with it? And if they do get away with it, why? Do they
Yeah.
get away with it because they have a plot immunity in your campaign, and so therefore it's just assumed that they go on and whatever? Is it assumed that because they are strong, they have the influence to get away with things because of this? They know the sheriff or the queen or the head of the merchants guild or whomever. That's those sorts of questions need to be hashed out when you run these sort of city-based urban adventures.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to know for the DM, I'd like DMs to be instructed on what is the point of these laws and rules and the interactions between the entities that govern the urban campaign and the PCs, because there is really rich territory there to mine, but it's not
Mhm.
as through the, you broke this silly rule or a serious rule, and that's the end. It should be about the larger story and how this reinforces it,
Mhm.
right? If it's a tyrannical rulership, then falling into some breaking some law is how you come into seeing that the settlement's rulers are thugs and the guards are thugs, and that you want to oppose them, right? And you get to see how the people are being
Mhm.
harmed by this, right? Or if the idea is that this is a place run by merchants and everything is done to support the mercantile aspects in the guilds, and it's the guilds who wield the power, then that's the interaction that you're seeing, right? And so it's almost like this section is provided without a premise, and the really important part to me is the premise. Like that's the part that one should work on, and the DM should learn to master over time, right?
Yeah. Yep. All of that is important. And how the how all of it works together, how the characters' roles in the setting, how the world's role in the adventures that they are going to go on, how all of that comes together, and how to navigate it. What challenges are you going to put in front? What conflicts are all this going to cause? Because that's what we're here for, right? We're here as the game master to present challenges and consequences for succeeding or failing at those,
Yeah.
and what it means for the game and what it means for the story.
And there are real pitfalls that hurt play, right? So like when you as a DM bring people into a settlement and nobody really learns what the settlement is known for, then the experience is shallow,
Mhm.
right? If you're in a town and you leave the town, you don't really know what's up. But that's where meeting the mayor, or meeting, a noble, meeting the person who runs who works for a guild, like getting those snapshots of life builds the character of this place and places it within the larger framework of the story. And you want to think through that and do that and find ways to make the experience tangible. Law and Order is one of them, but it's not the only one that then builds this relationship so
Right.
that it feels rich, right?
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
like Teos, I'm reading this, and I've read the Dungeon Master's Guide before, but I read it and then I put it away because I sort of knew how to run games already. And so as I'm reading through this again, like Teos, I go, oh, maybe there's something here I missed. Maybe there's something fun that I could use in an adventure that I might be working on. And I flipped the page from, urban encounters to unusual environments. I was like, I feel like we're missing a
Yeah.
chapter here on on this.
It's very surprising. And the urban encounters are great, right? So it's like, there's some fun snapshots that give you the concept of, hey, as a DM, here are the types of fun things that can happen when you're in an urban environment. And that's great. But but then it just ends. And it's like, wow, it's Law and Order and urban encounters, and off we go to different environments. Like, wow, I would want to see more in the next version, I hope. All right.
So we go from the dreaded streets of Lankmar or Greyhawk or Baldur's Gate
Mhm.
straight to underwater, which what climate change is moving us towards. So I guess that's a transition that makes perfect sense. Uh, so we go to underwater unusual environments underwater, and almost like the previous section, I'm like, okay, cool. Let's make this transition underwater. So the first thing it says is see chapter 9 of the player's handbook for rules on underwater combat. Okay, no problem. So I click that link because I'm using D&D
Mm.
Beyond, and the actual rules are only 4 sentences. There's 4 sentences of sort of introduction, and then there's 4 sentences on rules for underwater combat. They couldn't have just put those 4 sentences there
Wow.
instead of making the game master go to a completely different book. But even then, it's not. Here are some challenges of underwater combat. Here is why you might want to have underwater combat. This is why it can be fun. This is why it can be challenging. It's just go here, see the rules. Oh, and here's a table of random encounters underwater.
Well, and even chapter
All
9
right.
isn't fully complete, right? So there are some pieces here, and in our show
Not even
notes, in
close.
case DMs are curious, there are some. I've printed them in here in our show notes. But there are movement issues, there are breathing issues, there's melee and ranged combat, which is the part that gets in chapter 9. There's fire damage and
Yeah.
having resistance to it. So there's actually a grab bag of
Mhm.
things that you need to sort of put somewhere If you're a DM, like in fact, I did a
Mhm.
whole, like I was saying, when I ran Tomb of Annihilation, I did a whole underwater thing, and I had to pull all this stuff together because it wasn't anywhere. And that's literally
Mhm.
what I want out of the
Right.
DMG, right? Like that's what I want out of my underwater section. Tell me everything I need to run. Like,
Mhm. Yeah. It's true because I went to chapter 9 of the thinking, okay, I'm going to get a nice section here on underwater combat that I must have forgotten was here, and it didn't have the movement thing, it didn't have the breathing thing. Four sentences on melee, one on melee weapon attacks, two on ranged weapon attacks, and then one about the fire damage underwater, and that was all that was in the chapter 9 section of the combat portion of the player's handbook. So Teos has nicely dragged all of these underwater rules here in our show notes for you to look at. And then we, as I said, we get the underwater random undersea encounters. So roll a d12 and a d8 and you get a number from 2 to 20, but it's a sunken stone statue or monolith. uh Four of them, five of them are undersea caves.
mhm.
One empty, one with the sea hag, one with the merfolk, one with the giant octopus, and one with the dragon turtle. All right. And so it's fine, except that it's not enough. Uh, then
Yeah,
we
I
get
mean,
a section on
because
swimming, underwater visibility.
like
Yeah.
nothing here tells us how to get underwater. And that might sound simple to
Mhm.
some DMs, but to a lot of DMs, cool, I want to be underwater. How do I get there? Like, tell me all the ways, right? It's probably worth discussing the main ways that someone can even accomplish this. And how should you do it story wise,
Mhm.
narrative wise? Because at a lot of levels, you kind of can't pull this off. And swimming is a problem, as we get in some swimming rules here that
Mhm.
for you can't swim for a full 8 hours a day. After each hour of swimming, you have to succeed on a con saving throw or gain a level of exhaustion. So that won't be happening for long. And it doesn't address this at all, let
Mhm.
alone to me, Sean, which is the important part of being underwater. And this is something I think about a lot because I like that as a concept. It's very hard to pull off a great underwater experience because our brains very quickly just assume we're walking on the ground and
Mhm.
we forget we're breathing water. Uh, it
Mhm.
just becomes commonplace unless you do a number of things in your adventure to bring and highlight the fact that you're underwater, right? The currents come through and push you in this tunnel. There's a different
Mhm.
temperature
Mhm.
in the top half of this area than in the bottom half, right? Which happens with water current. Things like that. You've got to
Right.
add the Sargasso and yeah, and three-dimensional combat. Like you didn't mention
Mhm.
three-dimensional combat in this thing. Like that's the biggest part of being underwater.
Right. Right. And how hard it can be for low level characters to handle, and how easy it can be for high level characters.
Mhm.
At low level, if you go in without planning, if you try to run an underwater first level adventure,
Right.
if your characters don't realize that, oh, I better not be using this great sword or great axe, I better be using a spear or a trident instead, and you throw in a monster that's not hindered by the underwater
Mhm.
aspects, it's you're going to wipe the party out without even thinking. But then when you get high level where everyone can have water breathing or freedom of movement, then it sort of does become, it becomes less of a, a fantastical thing and more of a, yeah, I'm breathing and I'm swimming with no penalties. So really it's just like flying,
Yeah.
except for the fire damage I can't do as much.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that needs discussion, right? Because that's what makes that's what
Hmm.
DM it's in the list of DM things they need to know. Um Super shocking to look back. Just like you're saying in the previous section, like looking at this section, I'm like, really? This is what's here? And it's not that I don't like what's there, it's just that it's what's not there, the absence that really sticks out. Um yeah.
Exactly. We get more of a primer on owning ships and weather at sea and visibility, as opposed to actually having underwater encounters. So, the chapter's called adventure environments, but it feels like it could be combat environments versus adventure environments.
Mm.
So when you're on the ship at sea, what the weather could be, what it costs, and the sort of expenses that are ongoing if you own a ship, how much cargo a ship can hold, whether it's a warship or an airship or a rowboat. All of that is provided, which is good, which is
Mhm.
necessary. Uh, so at least in that sense, it gives the game master something to use as they plan their seafaring adventures.
And I think, they're trying to use the random encounters as a sort of like cool things to put into your game. But especially here where there is no uh the random encounters at sea table doesn't come with any additional information. It really misses the mark here
Mhm.
because it'll say things like floating debris. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you do with that, right? And I'd
Mhm.
almost rather this be 5 cool
Right.
things to add to a sea adventure that are illustrative of what you should do as a DM, right?
Mhm.
So floating debris at sea, followed by increasingly larger bits of debris, and then you
Mhm.
find what has happened, right? Or is happening. And
Mhm.
this is a great
Right.
way to create a neat, it feels maritime because you've got this debris thing that's floating.
Mhm.
It creates interest and piques everybody's curiosity. And then you play out whatever it is, the Kraken attacking a ship or the result of the shipwreck and they need help. It can be any number of scenes, but it comes
Mhm.
off of this piece, right? That kind of thing would,
Yeah.
to me, be a more of a how to that would you'd read this and you'd go, oh, okay, I will do things like this,
Mhm.
and I feel like I can do things like this.
Right.
These tables to me almost feel like just they don't they don't teach, right? They don't teach what's
Right.
possible and what would make a sea campaign neat, a voyage on the sea great. Like
Yeah.
yes, there's visibility
Right.
changes, but it's about telling people how to use those visibility changes that will make for an interesting encounter, not just having a table.
Yeah. If I rolled randomly on this encounter and I got pirate ship, I'd be like, oh, cool. And then I'm like, wait a second. How do I run a ship to ship combat
Right.
in a way that is reasonable, that's understandable? Okay, I guess I could push people off. How tall is a ship to climb if you get pushed into the water?
How does one
Those sorts
board?
of things where you just, right. How does one board a ship without a plank being lowered or a rope being lowered?
Yeah,
Is it even possible? Yeah, not
right.
to mention, what about cannons? What about,
I'm
right,
imagining my
those sorts
head.
of things?
Would be really hilarious is some scene where like two ships come together and then they hit, but then they bounce off of each other and then they have to like hit again, but they everybody's trying to board, but you can't
Right.
figure it out. Yeah, there's
It's
so
like
much
bumper
here
cars.
that just isn't filled in, and we get this table of
Mhm.
ships and there are really interesting design aspects to it. Um, 7 entries. One is an
Mhm.
airship, which ties into the sky section to have afterwards. Crew damage
Mhm.
thresholds, what it takes to repair. Ships are hugely expensive, 10,000 to 30,000 gold. So that brings a lot of question as to, if you gained one or if you buy one, what the players might expect out of that. And that alone is a topic because if you give someone a ship, they might turn around and
Mhm.
sell it when you thought they'd use it. Or if they keep it when you thought
Right.
they'd sell it and now they want to really use it, how do you run a campaign off of this? Right? And what does it mean to battle another
Yeah.
ship that has 300 to 500 hit points? And only when you deal 15 or 20 points of damage do you count the damage because of the damage threshold.
Yeah.
A galley has a crew of
How
80.
far? Yeah. Yeah. And what's 4 miles an hour in rounds, feet per
Hmm.
round? As I try to figure out how fast these two ships are closing on each other. Or yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
and there is some information
that's
on
why we
this.
had the DM's Guild, right?
Right. Well, and Ghost of Saltmarsh does add some pieces to this. It also hilariously rewrites a bunch of the stats for these ships. I don't even know why. So we do get
Mhm,
some later, but then Spelljammer goes and ignores most of it. So it is interesting that this is a huge aspect of the game. That it could be a huge aspect of the game, and it could be a really fun aspect of the game, but it really isn't put together. And I think any DM who has tried to run adventures on boats has wished there was a lot more support for it.
mhm, yeah. So we go from the sea to the sky, and 3 paragraphs. 3 paragraphs is what we get about the sky. One of the paragraphs is saying what flying is.
Mm.
They can move to one place to another in a straight line, ignoring terrain and monsters that can't fly.
Hmm.
Okay, thank you for that.
Hmm.
Uh, and then, it gives a little bit of information on mounts, and then but not a lot. And then it says you can make random encounter checks as you normally would as the characters fly. But if there's a monster that's not a flying monster in that check, the characters can just ignore them if they want.
And that's the kind of advice that is really important. This is true of teleportation as well, things like that, where it's like, what do you do if the players will skip the fun that you've planned for them, right? Or how do you alter the
Mhm,
fun so that you can bring them to the ground? Um, and what it means to explore, because this chapter began with wilderness exploration. Um, and there's some interesting
mhm,
rules, right? A flying mount must rest 1 hour for every 3 it flies, and it can't do it for more than 9 hours a day, assuming it's a living flying creature. If it's mechanical or a magic item or spell,
mhm.
then it ignores that. Um, and you convert flying
Right.
speed to miles by dividing by 10. So if a griffin flies at speed 80 feet, that means it travels 8 miles per hour, can do 9 hours, so 72 miles it can cover. That's a significant amount of space on a lot of maps. So, one of the things I'd want
Mhm.
to see here
Yeah.
is some advice to the DM on like, wow, when this shows up, which can be early if you have a druid that can summon animals, this is
Mhm.
this is important, and they may skip all the fun. And so if that starts happening, how do you bring the fun to them or bring them to the fun? They see smoke down below, a wreckage, something, and that draws them so they don't miss all of the action. Or how do you run a combat in the sky in 3 dimensions, right? Like that is also not here.
Mhm. Yeah, and the same questions about the depth of the ocean, the sea could be put here on the altitude of the flight.
Mhm.
When you're really, really high up, the air is thinner, it's colder. There might be winds that would affect you. All of that would have been really cool to be here as well. So we go right from the sky to traps, which is not an adventure environment per se, but I guess it had to be somewhere, so let's put it here. And we get all the things. There have been many great articles written about traps. Previous editions have handled traps very well. So what do we know about traps with this? Well, we learn immediately that traps can either be mechanical or magical, and we don't know if that's going to carry through and actually have any ramifications in terms of mechanically dealing with them, but we assume that it will. So we get then talk of triggers. All traps have triggers, whether they're mechanical or magical, may determine what that trigger is. So with the mechanical traps, you definitely have to interact with it in a way that moves a mechanism.
Mm.
So it could be stepping on a pressure plate, turning a doorknob, some way where something is moving and the mechanisms are triggered. Whereas magical can just be a proximity thing. If somebody walks into an area where there's a magical trap, just your presence there could set off the trap without actually harming or moving any piece of mechanism. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, just stepping back from this, so it's fascinating, this mechanical magic thing. Like, it almost makes me think like they rushed this. You know, we've heard that the DMG was sort of rushed. I wonder if they had a whole concept and then they just had to change it at the last minute. But
Mhm.
also they once again don't tell you the big glaring question, which is, when should I use a trap? What's the point of a trap? What is the fun of a
Yeah,
trap?
right.
As a DM, how will my
Mhm.
trap be awesome? What does that mean? Right?
Right.
It's almost again the
Yeah,
form
and
function thing, right? It's like traps can be found anywhere, so use them.
right.
Well, maybe, maybe not.
Mhm. Okay. Right. So they tell us about triggers. They tell us about detecting and disabling,
Mhm.
where they give you the ability to detect, usually with a wisdom perception check against the trap's DC, uh, passive check if people aren't looking for it, an active check if people are actively looking for it. I again, my game design hackles are raised a little bit there. You may call for an investigation check to deduce what needs to be done once the trap is found, followed by a dexterity check using thieves' tools to perform sabotage to disable the trap. And right there, I'm like, whoa, wait a second. So you're talking about three separate checks for a trap. First finding it, then one check to find it, one check to figure out what it does, and then one check to disable it. And if any of those fail, what happens? Do you really want three checks in order to disable a trap? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is no. But what are the game, story, and mechanic consequences of doing all those three things? Do you want
Yeah,
to slow the game down that much?
yeah, and it's been said by some folks that, maybe the DMG in particular was trying to appeal, as we know, was a core concept of fifth edition, trying to appeal to lots of different types of players that were existing players, and thus did not want to
Mhm,
be too prescriptive in saying this is the way you play. But it kind of
mhm,
ends up doing that anyway, just in a loose way. And what I would rather they have done is said, here is the default, and here's why, but here's why you should also change it. Because
mhm,
instead, it's like a loosely written piece that feels like it's the way, and thus has led to, I think,
mhm,
a lot of bad play. And it's always
yeah.
interesting to take this section and compare it to any printed adventure, which tends to be not actually a lot like this.
No, no. And if you start with something more concrete, like you say, Teos, then you can differentiate from it. I know that I personally like when they have sort of a stat block set up for a
Mhm,
trap,
mhm,
because what that tells me as both a designer and as a game master is I can set the standards and then I can give differentiation based on situation, as opposed to this loose sort of thing where really I have to invent the wheel every single
yeah.
time I create a trap. And not only am I creating that wheel, but now I have people using the wheel in ways that they did not expect to use the wheel. So they're thinking, why is he calling for an investigation check here when obviously this should be in my game an Arcana check? Uh, and then we get that sort of tension between what the expectations of different
Right.
players and game masters are.
Yeah, and some expectations are worth stating. Like, if you, the cleric, bump your wisdom up through the roof and take a feat, and now you feel like it is your God given right to find every single trap ever and never be impacted by a trap. How does that impact play? Or if
Mhm,
you're the rogue and you see yourself as the disarmer of traps, but the wizard is saying, well, any magic trap I should be able to handle, not you. Can't use thieves' tools on this. It's an Arcana
right.
check. Look where it says that in the DMG. These kinds of things are
Mhm,
not really, I think, thought through in fifth edition, unfortunately, to the detriment of play.
yeah. Right. Yeah. And traps can be a great addition to a challenge, to an adventure, to an encounter, if done well, but it's hard to do them well.
Mhm.
So an explanation of why it's hard to do them well and what steps you can take to remedy that difficulty and the resistance you might get from players for various reasons, many of which we've just discussed, are there. We do get a trap save DC table and a trap damage severity by level table, which is a good, at least it's something.
Yeah.
It's a start. So we can see that, if the save is 10 or 11, it's a setback trap. 12 to 15, it's a dangerous trap. 16 to 20, it's a deadly trap. And by damage by level, so we have each tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, the damage that should be done by each type of trap. So a setback trap for level characters 1 to 4 is only 1d10, whereas a deadly trap for 17th to 20th level characters is 24d10. And so at least I have a range. At least you are telling me, okay, this is what we expect traps to do in the game.
And this is interesting in two ways. One is that this is really one of the few places in the DMG or the rules where we get a window into expected damage output. So you can use this for a number of ways to calculate things and improvise things. In fact, I like having this table nearby to think of what is a hard hit or a medium hit or a light hit. And this deadly level is in fact quite deadly. I have seen the characters will die with these deadly levels of damage if they're a little bit hurt and you roll high on these things. And so it is interesting, like a lot of areas of 5e sort of will say things like deadly, but they lack any real punch. This stuff is for real.
Yeah. I think back to an adventure I wrote where there were 2 traps back to back. And if you miss the first one, you hit the second one. The second one drives you back into the first one. So it's sort of the double whammy if you're not paying attention. And the adventure was written for a range of character levels. So a deadly 10d10 trap against 5th level characters does a lot more damage than a deadly trap for 10th level characters.
Well, the good news is
tip my hat to Mike Shea on that one.
I was just gonna say the good news is people who would never complain about such things. They would just take it,
Nope.
Great maturity and deal.
Yeah.
2 other thoughts on this table. One is that this table, being as strong as it is mechanically, should then really come with something that says, what's the role of adding this to scene, to an encounter, to a combat encounter, or in between? Because it has an impact, right? How can we talk about challenge ratings and all this sort of stuff and then not address how this really impacts play? Even just in an instructional way. It doesn't have to be a mathematical way necessarily. Some people might want that, but just address it, right? Explain it to DMs that this is serious, right? You might be really beat up from a fight, and then you go to the chest to get your reward, and you get killed.
Right.
You want to think through that. It's also worth noting that Xanathar's revamps traps in a major way, including fine-tuning these tables and fine-tuning the next part we're going to talk about. So it's interesting to compare that. It was clearly seen as imperfect by the creators, and then they went and addressed it with Xanathars.
Yeah, because the next section talks about complex traps and how to sort of put traps together to make them more like a combat encounter, which is a good idea in theory, but as someone who has tried to do it in practice, there is a different mindset that goes into the players dealing with a trap as opposed to dealing with monsters. And if you don't get players in the right mindset, they are going to treat every complex trap, like a monster. They're going to try to defeat it by doing enough damage to it to render it useless, as opposed to making checks to shut it down. So just from me to you, you have to be very careful with trying to use this sort of complex trap system that's described here. And it's described in, again, 3 paragraphs that are probably 6 sentences total. So it's not, it talks about having the trap roll initiative and then having the trap do its damage and reactivating every round as sort of an action. And you got to be careful with that. Xanathar's does a better job with that.
Yeah.
But even then, it doesn't really get into that, how to make it work as its own thing, as opposed to other types of encounters that the players might be used to.
Yeah, and we get sample traps here, which are, if I recall correctly, different than the Xanathar's sample traps, which helps us then get a window into how they might play. Collapsing roof, falling net, fire-breathing statue, pits, several types, poison darts, poison needle, rolling sphere, sphere of annihilation. And so these give us those feelings of, okay, what does it feel like to have, this rolling sphere that's going around? I think that one might be revised in Xanathar's, but anyway, it gives you that concept of, okay, here are things I can emulate and play off of. And so I'm very glad for this. It may be not the most perfect design, which is fine, that happens, but it gives you a really good impression of what's possible. As you said, this is not an easy stat block format. It is text based in a lot of it and complicated to run, especially as compared to, say, 4th edition that had these nice little monster stat blocks. Those weren't perfect in their own ways, but they did have really nice stat blocks that felt like monsters, and so you could very easily grasp how to run them.
Yep. So I think we've reached the end of chapter 5, Teos. Any overall thoughts that we haven't already delved into?
I mean, I think that there is just so much here. The real story to me is the absence of what we would want to see here, both as topics. I mean, unusual environments. We could go to more places than they touched on. Traversing the wilderness, hex crawling, all of this. This is a chapter that tries to cover a lot, and I don't think does so in a particularly satisfying way. Everything is good. It just is not enough to cover the topics. It doesn't take the right approach to cover the topics or provide enough material for them.
Yeah. So we will now move on to chapter 6, where we find out what happens to characters between adventures. But that's for a different episode. So thank you, everyone out there, for listening. Thank you to our patrons, and thank you to our new patrons. We've had a little influx of patronage, and we sure do appreciate that. I know that for me, this can be a lot of work, and sometimes I'm run down. And when I get run down, what I do is go to our Patreon, and I look at all the people who are giving us a little bit of money to do this, and it gives me a jolt of energy. So thank you so much, everyone out there, for being patrons. To our Master of Dungeons supporters, thank you. To our Master of Realm supporters, we have you commemorated in our show notes. And to our Masters of the Multiverse, well, this is for you. Keith Ammon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Evil John, Darren Chandler, Seth Eckel, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, The Mighty Jerd, Ben Heidsler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Brian King, Jim Klingler, a.k.a. DM Prime Mover, Chad Lynch, The Mathemagician, Eric Mengi, The Micro Ant, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Ross Sandberg, Andy Shockney, Krishna, Joe Tyler, James Walton, and Graham Ward. Thank you so much. Thank you to our listeners. Thank you to our patrons. And if you like the show, please consider supporting us at our Patreon at patreon.com/masteringdnd. You can also support the show by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, telling us what you think. You can also subscribe to our show via YouTube, where you can see us up close and personal. Teos, where can people find you on the internet?
Find me at alphastream.org. I will be recording the next Success in RPGs today. I've
Ooh,
cleared my schedule, so I'm excited. We're going to talk about the Creative Commons license and provide the how to do it.
nice.
And Shawn, if I wanted to find you, what do I do?
Well, you can, just fly to Western New York. Here
Mhm.
I am. Or, if you don't want
Everybody
to get that
party at
close,
Shawn's.
that's
Woo!
right. If you don't want to get that close to me, which is probably the best move you can make, you can find me on Twitter at Shawn Merwin. The podcast is also on Twitter at Mastering D&D. We're on Mastodon. The show is Mastering D&D at Dice Camp, and I'm on Shawn Merwin at Tabletop Social. You can also join the Patreon, of course, and leave comments for us on our Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel. So, Teos, we've been through some adventuring sites, some adventuring milieu, if you will. Now we're getting ready to figure out what goes on between adventures. But what are we going to do now?
Oh, wow. Well, we are going to jump onto our griffin. We're going to
Mhm.
swim above the ocean and look down on those underwater encounters that our DM describes and just look at our DM like, what are you talking about? I'm not going down there. And then just continue
Mhm.
flying on.
Yeah, I'm
And
gonna get a
then,
sandwich.
oh, sandwich. Is that a downtime activity?
Mhm.
That
It
we'll
sure
cover that
is.
next week, right?
Yep.